Hello. Today I'm going to continue my summary of B.B. Price's book on medieval thought. This is the second part of the chapter on the vernacular breakthrough, dealing with the discovery of one's own tongue or language. So the book itself came out in 1992, and we'll have one more part after this next week. Discovery of one's own tongue. In the Middle Ages, Europeans could maintain a linguistic connection to both the cultural glories of Rome and to the See of St. Peter through Latin. Latin appealed to both political and religious leaders as a universal language, and indeed Latin continued to be used in legal and religious matters long after the Middle Ages. Linguistic regionalism was seen as a challenge to be avoided, hence the use of Latin in official documents. There was a great deal of variation in attitudes towards vernacular languages, however, ranging from strong support to strong resistance to their use. Some vernacular languages assumed a wider role early on, notably the use of the southern French Provençal as the language for poems of courtly love amongst native speakers of Catalan and Italian, as well as other dialects of French, and the use of Anglo-Saxon and later Anglo-Norman as trans-regional political languages, and for the Normans as an expression of their military and political power, Norman becoming fused with English. Attitudes changed over time, and the vernacular languages came to be highly regarded in the Middle Ages as an expression of the people, and as such, of political value to would-be leaders. They were also popular amongst historians, seeking a written representation of the people whose culture they represented. They could also be seen as a means of self-survival and self-expression, and over time were utilized for an increasing range of purposes, including plays for feast days, peace treaties, and love poetry. The increasing regard for the vernacular expression of one's culture came to emphasize regionalism and was thus probably the most de-unifying aspect of pan-European culture. Each language had its own distinctive history, so we talk about separate histories of English, French, German, and Italian here. They were not a unity. Let's start with English. As a result of successive invasions, three distinct languages emerged in England: Anglo-Saxon, or Old English, Old Norse, and Anglo-Norman. Anglo-Saxon was a Germanic dialect which had several regional variations and a vernacular literature. Its first known poet was Caedmon, a protégé of St. Hild, who had founded the Abbey of Whitby in 657. His poems were on religious topics. Then, from 887, Alfred, the highly educated King of Wessex, translated several works for the clergy from Latin into Anglo-Saxon, including Gregory the Great's book of pastoral care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and numerous extracts from the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great. Following the Viking invasions and occupation in the 9th and again in the 11th centuries, Old Norse dialects of Danish and Norwegian dominated in certain areas. Then in 1066, Duke William of Normandy successfully conquered the country, he and his men speaking Norman, Languedoc, that's the northern French dialect. Discontinuity in English vernacular literature followed, the ruling classes of church and state using Norman French. However, the common people continued to speak English, both groups resisting adopting the other's language. Only in the late 14th century did a new standard written form of English resurface in the form of Middle English. There are traces of local literary dialects from the 13th century onwards, but there's no sign of standardization. The standard Chancery Middle English, which did emerge, is represented by Geoffrey Chaucer, His dates are roughly 1340 to 1400, the most famous late medieval English poet. This was based on the urban dialect of London, enriched by the Midland dialects brought by immigrants to the capital in the wool trade. By the late Middle Ages, English had emerged as a viable standardized language used in literature, politics, and religion. Turning now to French. There was already a concern to preserve traditional vernacular oral recitations by the ninth century, and Charlemagne himself apparently commissioned a written collection of traditional songs and poems. But the first extant example of written Frankish vernaculars is in the Oath of Strasbourg in 842 between the troops of Charles the Bald and Louis the German, recorded in both Old French and Old High German. While the Carolingians were able to keep together a multilingual empire, their successors weren't. Thus, in West Francia, the Capetian dynasty, founded by Hugh Capet, spoke only the dialect of the Ile-de-France and was weakened by its failure to dominate French culture. Many dialects developed in two separate linguistic regions. The northern group, the Languedoc, included Français, Picard, Champenois, and Norman. The southern group, the Languedoc, included Provençal, Limousin, Gascon, and Catalan. By the end of the 9th century, there were manuscript poems, but no Romance language had made much literary import until the middle of the 11th century. Despite this diversity, chansons de geste, songs of heroic deeds, including the Song of Roland, were common in various northern dialects by the 11th century, whilst in the south, Provençal became an almost common cultural language created by the troubadours and having a widespread impact across Europe from the 12th through to the 14th centuries. There were many French translations from Latin, including Vegetius's On Things Military, Boethius's Consolation, the letters of Abelard and Eloise, and various accounts of the Crusades. A lack of linguistic confidence meant that a lot of the work was relatively uniform stylistically, with little individual voice, so to say. This changed in the 13th century with the appearance of works such as the Romance of the Rose, Roman de la Rose. But in the 14th century, French had lost its wider appeal. It remained unstandardized throughout the Middle Ages. Now German. Even when the Roman Empire was strong, most of Germania remained outside its dominion, and its peoples carried on using their own languages. Various dialects developed, including Bavarian, Saxon, and Frankish, all with early written works. These are lumped together historically as Old High German. By the 9th century, the whole area, including the left bank of the Rhine in the west, over to all the lands between the Danube and the southern Alps, was dominated by German speakers, including its Frankish aristocracy. There was no linguistic affinity with Latin, which had to be learnt as a foreign language. This was hard, so Notker the Stammerer, a 9th century monk from St. Gall, wrote a treatise on rhetoric, explaining the technical terms in German. Notker and others used German as their language of instruction, preferring to translate Latin classics, including Boethius, Cato, Virgil, Terence, and also Aristotle and even parts of the Bible, into German. He was criticized because such translations were regarded as dangerous innovations, but he replied that readers would be able to understand these texts much better when they were in their own language. German vernacular literature began to develop rapidly in the 12th century, using an elevated Middle High German. Although this declined in the 13th and 14th centuries, sermons, legal works, and medical works in German were widely circulated. A standardized literary German, however, only developed with Martin Luther's translation of the Bible in the 16th century. Finally, Italian. Spoken Latin had never been uniform, and these differences were already apparent in early Christian inscriptions. Like most spoken languages, Vulgar Latin used a simplified vocabulary and syntax compared to the written language. Thus, Augustine's sermons were given in a Roman dialect, and they put the burden of meaning on word order rather than inflection, as in classical Latin. A clear distinction between the various Italian dialects and Latin was slow to emerge. Sicilian was the first to assert itself as a separate literary language, not surprising given the island's political and administrative unity and separation after the 10th century. The first Italian lyric poetry was written in Umbrian in the 13th century by Francis of Assisi and others, for example, his psalm-like Canticle of the Sun. Tuscan became the leading literary language in the 13th century, its writers having the advantage of a central location of the peninsula between northern and southern dialects. Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, all Florentines, took the lead. Dante had aimed to produce a written form that was refined and above various local dialects. So thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, Sina Farzel, David Langness, Anthony Lee, Ian Palin, Johannes Rosenbaum, Steve Scholl, Ismail Valesco, Tobias Wetter, Tricia Williams, Jonah Winters, and Gloria Yazdani. You're very welcome to support my channel if you want to. Please do like, comment, and share my videos if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give links to my Patreon and PayPal links below in case you want to offer practical support. Next week we'll finish off the chapter with the social context and consequences of the use of the vernacular. Have a good day.